Hey everyone, Sycra in here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to draw hair. So, hair is, I'm not an expert on hair, so I'm going to do my best. It's kind of more complicated in some ways and less complicated in other ways. But the first thing I do, because I'm not an expert at hair, when I want to draw, if I want to draw a specific hairstyle, the first thing I do is consult reference. So here I have a bunch of reference, and I'll talk to you about what I look for when I look at reference, and it's the same as the stuff I look for, or I try and keep in mind when I'm drawing from imagination. So, yeah. So the first thing I notice, and I tend to think of I don't know, notes to myself when I look at things. When I want to learn about something, I'll often think about my preconceived notion, and then I'll think about it or look at the reference more and try and determine whether or not that is true. So, for an example, let's look at this guy's hair, right? Or like any hair here, but this one in particular. When I look at it, it looks pretty complicated, right? It's got like this big swirl to it. Maybe I'll just show you up close. It's got like a swirl to it and all these hairs, but if you just look at the shape of it, it's actually really, really simple. So if you think of the head and just doing the outline, it's basically, with the exception of okay, there's like a little indent there and an indent there, but let's ignore that. Just look at the big basic shape. It's like a big circle, and it's got like a little strand here, but very simple. Very, very simple shape. Same with this one. It's just like this big, poof. There's tons of stuff going on the inside, but in terms of external shapes, it's very simple. Even this beard, very simple. And these hairstyles, I just looked for what is popular in 2018 for hair, and I got that. I got like a bunch of different things pop up, but I'm not really up to date with fashion or anything, so for me it helps to just look at reference if I want to know what do people do these days, because I stay inside a lot. Anyway, let's look at this one, for instance. Again, very, very simple on the outside in terms of a basic shape, and so that was really kind of eye-opening when I noticed that, when I first noticed, oh, okay, so you don't need to have that much craziness going on outside if you're doing most hairstyles. Some of them are kind of crazy, but most of them can be simplified into a very basic shape. Even this one, which looks very complicated, it's just like a big circle, really, right? So that's what I first look at. If I was then caricaturing, I would use that to kind of as a prop. So let's say I was doing a caricature of her, and I wanted to show that her hair is really big. Maybe I'd make this face really small, like the head really small, but keep that hair. But I'd still go with this very basic circle shape. So that's the first thing I look at. What is the head shape? And in this case, it's a bit more like this shape, but again, it's a very simple shape. And then you've got the hairline doing this, and then you break it. And why this is good is because if I can think of a basic shape, I'm much more likely to be able to implement it when I'm creating stuff from imagination. Like these ones I find more difficult. These curly, or like more than wavy, yeah, it's just very time consuming and annoying to me, but when I can see it as a basic shape, it's much easier. So what I would notice about this shape, for instance, is how the hair has this diagonal flow to it. So it's kind of like that. Like it's very asymmetrical, but very, very much has a lot of movement to it. So it's kind of, comes a bit more like that. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. And I would put that note in my mind that, okay, so, you know, you've got this hair and it's got a certain type of shape, and that shape you might think is, like when you think of the shapes, you might want to just do this and make something very symmetrical, but you don't have to. You could do something like, I mean, just to exaggerate that, let's just do something like this and then have the hair kind of go like that. So you've got this flow to it. And now this one's just a circle. When it comes to complicated hair, often, even when it is complicated, it's usually, and this isn't, again, it's not always, but it's usually complicated down here. So what you can see is a lot more of this rounded head shape, where the head is on the, or the hair is lying on the head and then it falls down. See here? Like, it's not complicated at all on the top, but then down here, you know, it gets more complicated. In this case, I would simplify it just like a circle, and then the skull shape is very apparent. So you got 1, 2 big shapes. That's kind of what I see this head as. Basically 2 shapes. And this one, boop. Same with this, like very contained. So why this helped me is because I was thinking hair is really complicated and I was getting very intimidated by it. But you don't have to be so intimidated. So this is the first thing, basic head shape. What is a basic head shape? And if you're caricaturing or making a cartoon or even making an anime, how do you, or a manga, sorry, how do you simplify that head, you know, or how do you exaggerate it? When you know something like that, like this kind of just has this shape to it, this mohawk, then what I could do is, if I was exaggerating it, I could do something like this, you know, like really push that part forward. Maybe the back part comes out a bit more like that. But basically it's the same idea, right? So that's the first thing, head shape. All right, so the next thing I look at is the hairline. And for me, this is super, super important. I really like to get it, but in this trend, especially for the men, there's this thing of cutting the hairline so it looks super sharp, like the super clean, I don't know what you would call it, but this extremely clean, defined thing, which is like, okay, it kind of screws with all the things I do with hairlines, because what I do with hairlines is I try and keep them very soft. So when I see a hairline, I try to consider how the hair flows, and I keep that edge pretty soft. Like, I don't use a sharp line to convey that. Whereas in this case, you kind of have to use a line just because that's what they've done. They've sharpened everything. But, I mean, that aside, I'll just talk about, you know, what I normally do, which is I make the hairline very fuzzy. And this is a good example here of a hairline. If you look at this, you're not going to see a defined line. like, okay, we can say, yes, it's here. Here's the separation of the hairline, but I can't tell you exactly where it is. If I was to draw something, it would like, well, it comes out like this, comes out there. Then you've got all these little tiny hairs, and so the hairline itself is quite hard to say it is right here. So the way I do this is first I look at it. What's the shape? And people have different shaped hairlines. Well, this person has this shaped hairline. Some people have hairlines that are, a bit more straight across, like that. Some people have like a widow's peak, kind of goes down. When it comes to the sides, you get like this shape, but with men, it often tends to be a bit more angular, the shape. And let's just look. Yeah, so here you have more of an angled shape here. Here it kind of goes down like a widow's peak, and then you get this kind of shape. What I noticed with it is it tends to have kind of like a lightning bolt in it, where it goes down, then it goes around, then it goes down again. So here they've kind of adjusted it in these hairstyles, but still the way I see it is more like kind of like this shape, and then it goes like this. But again, I don't draw the line. So what I do is, as I mentioned, is I kind of use broken lines to suggest this. And if I'm going for a more, like if I have to draw something where I want to color quickly, like let's say I have like an anime hairstyle, it's doing whatever, and I want to color this area. If I have broken lines, it's going to be hard to get in there, and the reason it's broken is just because it implies that there's not a hard edge between these two things. It makes it a soft edge. So another way to get a soft edge is to use kind of these shapes where you're breaking it, right? You're creating these little triangle shapes. So then I can still use a hard line and contain this, but this gives the appearance of a soft edge, because that's what you're going for. So yeah, with hairlines, I like to think of softness, especially, like this. This is very soft. See how if you squint really hard, this almost blends into the skin. It's just that soft of an edge, So if I was drawing this, either I would be doing something like this, where I'm actually drawing more of just the hair and not really drawing the hairline. I'm just kind of letting it stop like this, or I would be grouping it into triangles like this if I wanted to, show or have more of a connected line. So for instance, if I wanted to just fill this area now, it's not so difficult to fill, right? You could just fill all this. All right, so that's the next thing I look at, is the hairline. What is the hairline doing for guys, especially? That can be very different, depending on what the... Actually, don't think I had any balding people here, but when people do bald, their hairline starts to recede, and it just keeps going. So usually it starts like, let's say it starts like this. Let's say this guy's balding, because it looks like he is. He's on his way. All right, so hair's kind of like this. The hairline's kind of like this at first. Oh, that's another way you can do it. Rather than use a single line like this, if you want something to look fuzzy or soft, you can also create like double lines. Like here, I'm just I don't know. I don't think there's a rule to how many. I tend to use 2 or 3, but it creates like this softer look, and I tend to do that a lot for these areas right here, and maybe for these I tend to have, like, you can also draw the line like this and then break it up by using these little zigzaggy shapes, and it creates like a soft edge look. But anyway, so his hair looks like this, and that's okay. But probably as it recedes, this part is going to start to pull back. So his hair is going to get less like that, and then it's going to start to kind of like that. Widow's peak's probably going to get more and more reduced until it's just gone, and you get something more like this. And at this point, my professional advice is just go bald. It looks better. But yeah, so you've got like a progression that you wanna maintain. But there are people who have quite a strong widow's peak, and then the hair's receding, but it's still like you have this forward area that comes out, and then it recedes and goes back. So you have a bunch of different things going on. So again, this is why I use reference, because there's a lot, and it's very hard for me to keep it all in mind. And usually when I draw hair personally, and this is why I feel slightly unqualified in a way to talk about hair, is that I tend to just go crazy, tend to do like whatever weird shapes. I mean, he wouldn't be having this type of hairstyle, but whatever. Like, I just do very, very strange shapes. So, and the reason I do that is just because, I mean, look at it. Look at the variety of hair. Look at all the things you can get away with. There's so many things you can do with hair. And even when you're doing portraiture, like, here's a good example right here, is you have this person and you have their face. So if you want to get the likeness, it's pretty much all here, right? Like, that's describing the person. And so what this functions as, all this external area, is you can use it to sort of frame the face and also create rhythm, create flow, have this dynamic energy. Like, whoa, it's cool, and as if it's super windy and stuff. You could do, just a bunch of stuff, but you still get the likeness. So, if you did that with the face, and you're like, well, it's super windy, let's move the eyebrow and the eyeball, and the nose is like there now, and woo, it wouldn't really work. But with the hair, you can totally do that, right? Like, just blow it this way. And then maybe for her hair is like blowing around that way. So yeah, I love the freedom hair offers. And I think it's something that you should really exploit just because you can get away with it. Like, in art, I feel there are a few things you can get away with, and you can use them to your advantage. And hair is one of them. Lighting is one of them. You can just light people however you want, and then make it all dramatic if you need to, or anyway. So back to hair. All right. So the next thing I look at after the hairline is I look at the flow, and hair has a direction. So part of that is because of gravity. It flows. I mean, in this case, it's flowing down, right? So that's gravity, is it's pulling it down. But it also has a flow sort of within itself. And what I like to look for are where lines are converging. So in this case, with this person's hair, you can see it's a very easy flow. It's like you could add a point here, and then everything is flowing from that point, right? So this one's super easy. Just the flow is just going from here down, or, I mean, it doesn't make any sense in terms of physics, but you can also reverse it and say the flow is going that way. Like all the hairs are coming to this point. Either way, you could think it's going down from this point or towards this point. But yeah, that describes the flow. So that one's super easy. Let's look at this one. Well, in this one, the hair is first, you have this part here, and then you've got a flow, and the hair is kind of all getting pulled towards this line. So instead of it being a point, it's now a line, and the hair is flowing from that area. With this one, it's a bit like perspective, really. With this one, the flow is here, right? You can make a little circle here, and then notice how the hair is just all trying to get towards that circle, or you could think of it as something that's, you know, emanating from that circle. But it's got this very definite flow. With this one, it looks very complicated because individually each hair is kind of doing its own thing, right? It's all curling. But the way I look at the flow of hair like this is just kind of like an explosion. Like it's all outward energy coming from this one point. And again, anytime you see something like a basic head shape or a head flow or even a hairline, it's an opportunity to exaggerate that and take advantage of it. So, you know, if I wanted to make this hair extra explodey, I could do that, but everything would be returning to this one point. All right? In the case of this hair, there's very little flow necessarily. So this one is like this is a mystery hair. The person's very mysterious. But as it grows, you can see, like, you've got a flow. Everything's kind of pulling towards the center here. Yeah. In this case, again, it's one of those line flows where everything is pulling towards these lines. And then coming out. So plants are this way too. They tend to have a flow to them. In this case, it's all, like if I put a point here, everything kind of emerges from that point, so that's the flow. Again, these ones are, I hate these ones, they're super hard. Because there is a flow, and the flow is, you really have to look at it, but it's kind of like you've got this area coming down, and this coming down, and it's all sort of coming from this line again. It's like one of those line ones, like this one as well, right? But this one's line kind of goes like this zigzag, but it's all going towards that. This one, it's the same thing. It's just each individual thing is crossing over and being very complicated. These ones are easy. So let's look at some other ones. So this one, flow is kind of all, this one is coming at this direction. It's all sort of pulled. I guess you could think of it kind of like these lines could all be going towards her forehead. And again, that's sort of like perspective, where when you do perspective, lines recede to vanishing point. So these lines are receding to a vanishing point, but it doesn't mean that these lines are actually on the ground. You won't see these lines usually. Maybe if you're drawing a road or something, you might actually see something. You can say, well, these are lines, but they're abstract ideas. And so in this case, I would be thinking of like, well, yeah, it's sort of an abstract idea. Okay, so this one's flow is easy. You know, it's all going sort of, I guess if I put the point down, it would be sort of here in his head. Right, so you can kind of see how it all emerges from this point. And then you just get rid of all this part. And then, wow, looks cool. Looks like it's very complicated, but we can see, no, it's just coming from a point. In this case, it's the same thing. The point is back here, so it's a bit hidden from view, but you've got this flow. In this case as well, sort of goes up and down. I mean, this one's kind of hard because the hair's, you know, it's gelled and it's doing what it wants to do. But in this case, it's just going down, right? On the sides, it just goes down. These are all the explodey types again, where, you know, the flow is all coming outwards. This one, obviously, it's kind of like the other one. It comes from a point that is kind of in his head, and then it's all going around. And then you can get rid of that. I mean, when you get used to it, you don't draw necessarily a point in a person's head, but if you're just starting out, it might not be a bad idea to sort of help you see, you know, how do these things flow, and to find a common point can often be a lot more helpful for creating complicated things than if you're just looking at this, and you might get wrapped up in a lot of like, well, this piece of hair comes down and then this one goes up and then this, you know, it's got more of a complex thing to it that can sort of fool you. This one's flow is very, very like waves. It's doing this. This one is madness. The way I see it is I see a line here, and then I see this hair going down from that line, and then I see all these coming out in weird ways from this line. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it. But remember the basic head shape, where we begin. It's very simple. It's just that. So you could start with something like this. If I wanted to draw this guy's head, I could start with something just simple like that. And then I can look for this line. Now that line's kind of hard to see, but it's there. You see it here? There's that line. All right, so then I get that line. Then I know these parts are just coming down, and they kind of have this cut where they stop. And then these ones are all coming out. And you can use these things as a base. Like, you can start with that and then say, all right, now I'm going to actually zoom in and make these more, you know, individually complex. But that's kind of getting to the next point, which is grouping hair into clumps. So this one is super easy. You kind of have you have a clump here. So this would be the front area, the front region. Then you have two sides, you know, this on the side and this on the side, and you have your back. And so these are all coming this way, and this one's kind of coming forward towards us. So those are the basic clumps. In this one, you have this area, this like big section here, and then you have all these going back. So this is the front clump, which is that one. Then you have the side clump here, and then you have this back one, which is sort of doing this. You've got this section, you've got this section, and then you've got the mess. This is also, you can think of it as a clump with a bunch of little external things, but it really helps to simplify hair into just basic shapes that are much easier to hold in our head. This one, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You've got, you know, this section, and then you've got your little your rows of weave. So you've got that. And this one, it's just one giant clump. But you can also see there is like a part here. It's kind of hard to see, and this part comes down. So you could look at it in a bit more detail as a more complicated shape. But I'm still thinking of big shapes. Like, I'm not thinking of each individual hair strand. That's not what you want to do. You want to think of it as bigger clumps. And when you get things like this, the tendency might be to see, like, well, there's a piece of hair, and 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 there's one. Or to say maybe, like, well, there's a clump, there's a clump, there's a clump, there's a clump. Like, just break it into tiny clumps. But it really helps, I think, to think of it more like big areas. So you have like this as the forward clump. And then you have the side one here. And notice this part, like the parts are really important because they do different things. Like what I used to do with parts is I would think of it more like this one, or I like for women, I often put it right in the middle. And for men, I kind of have it more like this, like off to the side, and then the hair does whatever. But actually there's a lot more variation than just that. And even this one, it kind of goes this way and then it curves that way. In this case, it goes this way. In this case, it just kind of goes up. In this one, it really goes like this way, this way, this way, this way. And so you get the front clump is like all this area. That's our first pass. And then you've got the side clump, which is doing this. And then you've got the other side clump, which is doing this. So this is the simplification of this hair, is probably this. Maybe we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could think of these two connected, but let's just say they're separated. Okay, and then within that, you have like 1, 2, 3. So that makes things easier. And notice how these aren't equal. If they were, it would look pretty ugly. And that's a tendency you have to fight against, especially if you're a beginner. The tendency is to kind of separate things very evenly. Kind of looks like bananas now, but have some shape variation. So you have these 3, and then within them, you separate further. So you get the big shape, and then you break it down piece by piece, and what happens in the end is you can create something that's quite complicated, that looks very complex, and I mean, it is in the end, but the method you use to get there is not complex, right? So looks hard, but wasn't hard to do. And I think that's a very good thing here, right? If we look at the clumps, there's 1. And you can think of these, like this one, I would think of like a ribbon. And then there's this one, and then this one, and then this one. And then after you've got your big clumps, you can always make hair that doesn't obey that. So let's say I put these clumps. Well, I could then do like one that's just doing something like this, just cuts. And then, you erase things, you have things overlapping, and you can add a lot of detail after the fact. That's not hard, and you just have your major things done. So this one's super easy. Just goes like this. So there's 1, 2. I mean, if you looked at the back, you probably get a third one. But you have this, and this one bends over itself, so it comes like down this way, and then kind of comes out. And then it's really, in this case, it's kind of up to you how you want to separate these ones. I would probably think of this as the same as this, but in terms of grouping, I would probably think of them differently. So, that's kind of in shadow, and this comes this way. So the next thing I want to talk about is highlights. This, especially in terms of people who look a lot at cartoons or comics, can be overdone a bit, and people often go to pure white. But highlights generally are not. This is very shiny hair, and so you do have more of a contrast. But in general, you know, see here, like this doesn't go to white. If I was to put white highlights, which is kind of what people often do, they kind of want to go towards pure white. You'll see how it's too bright, and it makes the hair look, I mean, very, very shiny, but it's a bit too much. So what I think of is, the first thing I think of is, well, it's not too different. Usually the highlight is not too different from the hair color. Again, in extremely shiny cases, like this one, there's quite a huge difference. Even in this case, there kind of is, but in a lot of cases like this one, there's not that big of a difference. This one, you barely notice it. You know, this one, you don't really notice it as much. This one, it's very bright, but that's because it's blown out by the sun. So, because you can see on the shirt too, how it completely, the light just removed any information. So the first thing I think is, there's not, whatever my tendency is to do with highlights, I should try to tone it down. Usually that's the direction to head in, is err on the side of things being a lot more toned down. Now, in the case of reference, it's much easier to think of highlights in black and white. So I'm just gonna get rid of the color so we can look at more of the highlights. So with highlights, they do this kind of banding thing. And this is a very good example here, where you have the highlight sort of grouped in this shape, and it's sort of a band that goes around. And again, you have this here. And when I look at this hair, I think of it kind of like you have this major highlight shape, which is this, like this big highlight shape. But it's broken down into a lot of smaller highlight shapes as well. So you've got like this clump, and within this clump, it kind of has this type of shape. So when I do highlights, I tend to think of, like, let's say there's a strand here. I learned this from Loish, but you get kind of like this type of shape, like a letter H, kind of, see, letter H. I found that it's kind of accurate, but not fully, but it kind of works. So I make my highlights not even. I don't do things like this. If I wanted to make highlights on a strand of hair, I don't do this. That is way too regular. I'll be a lot more kind of random about it and make kind of like if it was a seismograph, you would be having a bad time, right? It's a pretty bad earthquake. Everything's going. Yeah, so there's that. So let's look at this one. You see it, the banding, and it goes around. So you have this band of highlights. With curly hair, it's different, so I can't talk about that just yet. But in this case, you can see there's a highlight and it forms in a band. Again, so you get these ribbon-like shapes with a highlight right across it. So like, there's the highlight. Here it's super easy. There's a highlight, but you'll see how you get this kind of like seismographic separation between light or the highlights and the rest of the hair. So that's one way of making things look nice and shiny, is look for the highlights and don't overdo it. You don't need to put highlights everywhere, like here and here and here and another one here, and just one here is good because that's where the light bounces and hits towards your eye. Okay, so for the guys, because the hair is more complicated, you get like random highlights a lot more. And we could try to actually isolate some of that. So let's try this. What I'm gonna do is going to put an adjustment level thing so we can just turn all these from to as pure as we can and just see where the highlights are. So something like this, you can now see a lot of these hairstyles don't really have highlights. In the case of this one, in the case of this one, it's dyed hair, and this one as well, it's dyed hair. See? So that's not exactly highlights. This one is highlights, this one. But you can see it's not that much, and in a lot of cases there aren't any highlights that show up. So even when you do stuff from imagination, you might want to remember that. In this case, for this one, you can think of it kind of like, again, a zigzaggy shape like this, and then it kind of fades, and then you get little zigzag additions, kind of. But you've got that highlight shape. And this one, again, very obvious. So, yeah, this is a good way of looking at hair and seeing, okay, what do the highlights actually do? All right, so after you've got the big hair shape, you've got the flow. Oh, I wanted to talk just one more about the highlights with the hair here. See, it's more these dots that describe the form, and they're sort of in a weave. So you have to know how to do braids. And I'll show you a quick way of doing braids. But I just want to finish what I was going to say. So after you've got all the big things, the final thing you do is all the wispy little, like you get the big hair shapes, and then especially when I paint, I just put another layer of hair that kind of does its own thing, that goes stray. And it's this final layer, which really doesn't take much time. That's the one where people look at it and they think like, oh, wow, you painted every single hair strand, or you drew all the hairs. And it looks very complicated, but it really isn't. So it's just something you do at the end. And see, like even this, it looks like it took a lot longer than it really did. I'm just thinking about really big things. And then once I've got the big things in place, like this, for instance, I would look at this person's hair. I'd think of it like this, as a basic shape. And then when I actually add some detail, I would, separate it. Think about design. So what I mean is, like, let's take this as an example. You don't just want a straight line like that. See how it breaks? But it doesn't break evenly. It's not like this all the way across. You've got like this section and this, and then it's a little break, and then you've got a bigger clump, then a little break, and then sort of a bigger clump, then a little break, then another little break, and then this huge boop, boop, boop clump here. So that's a lot more interesting than if you just made it, or even, it's better if it's like, just more to it. Same with this, right? It's not just it's got like this comes like this, and you've got some like sharper parts and then some more flat parts, and that can look a lot nicer, a lot more interesting. All right, so that's the last thing. In anime type stuff, you get hair more like this, where you have like this hair, but then you've got this one overlapping, and you can sort of overlap and change directions and do things. Again, when I draw hair, I'm not drawing lines. Like, I don't do this. Like, you might have noticed when I was drawing his hair, I do like these types of shapes. They're more like leaf shapes, I guess. I mean, here I might do individual lines here just to suggest this textural difference. But I think of the big clumps as their own thing. And then what you can do after you get these is really make this look three-dimensional by adding occlusion shadows. So occlusion shadows are just where light doesn't get to and you get a very dark shadow. So usually that happens when two things touch, but you can also kind of add them in places where you have overlap. So this strand of hair right here, for instance, overlaps this strand of hair here. So what I can do is I'm going to use like a triangle shape, but it's more like, it's not like this, it's more like this. You'll see. Okay, so I do this shape, shade that in, let it sort of fade off, and now it looks like, oh, this has dimension. I'm gonna, where these two overlap, I'll do the same thing. Maybe in here, maybe here, as these two overlap, here again. And by adding these little triangular shadow triangles, you get this feeling of depth. And the reason they're triangles is just because you've got light kind of coming in here. So at this point, it's not going to get in. And they're very small. I'm actually making them much bigger than I would for the sake of demonstration. I would probably just make like tiny little occlusion areas. When I paint, I sometimes think of them a bit more like dots that you just put in. But yeah, as you add these, it starts to create little pockets of shadow that make it feel like, oh, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of interest, right? Stuff like this. Especially as you kind of fade into them from different hair strands, right? You could add like a lighter shadow that's being cast from this. And I'm just making up stuff, but I'm just trying to show you how it can kind of look deep and like you have a lot going on. So yeah, that's something, but that comes really after everything else, like the hair flow, the hair shape, stuff like that. So I wanted to quickly cover braids because they can be tricky. The way I think of them is I make 3 lines. This describes the outer edge, and then you have a line in the middle. Now, I actually don't make this middle line. Sometimes I don't even make the outer lines, but I think of them. But in the beginning, it's probably good to actually draw them very lightly. Then what you do is you make like a zigzag. And depending on which direction the hair is going, you do the braiding. So you could make the braids going this way, like that, or you could make them going this way, like that. It's really up to you. So let's just say they're going this way, right? So what you do is I have these zigzaggy things, and then you're basically just going from the edge. You go towards the edge and you create, like that's one shape, right? You create a shape like that, and then you do that again and again, and you only go so, like you try and keep this, I guess it's a triangle, within this line. So that's why there's the outer lines, to kind of keep you in that. Okay, so I do that. See how I'm sort of connecting it? Just do that for all of this. And then on the opposite side, you do this. So this one flows into this one. And then you do this, and this, and this, and this. And by the end, you get like a braid look. And what happens is you have this strand and it goes around here, and then it goes here, and then it goes here, and then it comes out there, and then it would go out here somewhere. All right, so that's one, and then you've got this one, which comes here, and then it goes there, and it goes there, and it goes there, and it goes there, and then, you know, you can see in between. I don't really have to shade it in, but that's the third strand. And the way you create it, again, is with that zigzaggy shape. So that's the first thing, are the 3 lines to kind of create your borders. Then you create the zigzaggy shape on the line, and then you create this stuff in. In terms of detailing, what you can do is, again, right where these things touch, where you have overlap, you can kind of put the occlusion shadows and sort of build the hair so it's, so I just put it in all the little corners. See how it adds depth? It looks like, oh, the hair's actually going inside now. Then when you add the detail, you can kind of create, you know, like a rounded shape that's going in, and then like this part's going in like that, and this part's going in. So again, it's one of those cases where at the end it's going to look super complicated, but in the beginning it's really not. So anyway, you just do that. So that's the braid thing. So that's the big things. If I'm drawing certain types of hair, or especially if I'm painting certain types of hair. So let's say this hair, I was painting this guy, right? What I would actually do is I would be thinking more like this, like just a big shape, but make sure the edge, the outside edge, is a lot more randomized. And then, so I'd create like the big shape, and then he's got like little, I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know all the terms, but the poppy out bits. And then you just have the highlights, right? And they're kind of doing little mountains. So what I would do is I'd pick a color and kind of create those mountains, but only with the highlights. So I'm not drawing much. I created an outside shape, and then I'm just adding little inner shapes, and I'm keeping the lighter ones towards the edge and letting it kind of fade off. So, I mean, if I ever make a how to paint hair tutorial, I guess that is more, this would be more about that, like how to paint, but you get kind of the idea here without having to do much work. So I'll just quickly do some hairstyles from imagination so we can kind of walk through the process. So, all right. So we start with our basic head shape, can be whatever. Let's just create this. And head shape as in the head without any hair. So that's the first thing I think of. If you've seen my how to draw appealing bodies, you'll get what I'm doing here. Okay, so that's a basic head. Let's do a guy first. And next is the hairline. So what is, or next is the head shape. So what do I want the hair to be doing? Well, it could be doing anything. It could be, you know, maybe it's going up, like it could go up or it could go down. So really it could be anything, but let's just do this. I'm going to make it very pushed here at the top, and then I want it to go down. So it's basically in that shape if you looked at it from really far. And having a very simple shape makes an iconic character, right? Like how many characters do you know them by their head shape? If I do this, I'm not sure I'll even get it right in terms of how many lines there are, but you can tell, like, I don't know, kind of, it's like a Bart Simpson type, whatever. There's so many characters that are really defined by the shape of their hair. And I mean, it's a great way of getting designs to look more interesting or to look more recognizable, right? Like if I have this guy and he's the sharp-headed guy, and then I have a girl and her head shape is more like that, more rounded, then these two, from super far, you can already tell who's who. You just look for this shape and, oh, okay, that's the rounded haired one. This one's the spiky one. So anyway, get that. I'll do both of these characters at the same time. Why not? All right, so we have this, we have this. Let's get the hairline now. So for this guy's hairline, I guess it can be slightly a widow's peak. And then I'm going to go around. Remember, it goes like, you have like this part, and then it goes in, and then you have the sideburn. So you've got this little shape. So we get that, and this is going to come around like that. All right, so that guy's hairline's done. For this one, let's just make it pretty much a straight line, but let's include a bit of that. See this, it's very angular. Here I'm just going to be a bit more soft. And I'm also going to be a bit more light about it, make more of a fuzzy edge. I suppose I could do that with this guy too. I mean, that's another way of doing it, by the way. What I just did is, if you want to make a hairline sort of fuzzy, you can make a line that's hard and then just sort of erase, and it'll look fine. So there's a lot of different ways of getting this look, but okay. So we have that. All right, so what's the flow? Well, this one's pretty much an explodey type. And this one's going to, let's just put in a part here and have the hair kind of go down from this line and then sort of up and kind of, I'm going to make it kind of pulled in this flow. So it's going towards this shape. All right. And now let's think about the clumps. Okay, well, I kind of have some clumps going on here. So let's say this is the big form and it kind of turns around. And that's like the front clump is this whole area. And then these ones kind of break off towards the side. And maybe some of these fall. I mean, this one kind of breaks the silhouette, so I'm going to get rid of that one. All right, and then for this one, let's not have too many clumps. It's just going to give kind of a randomized line on the outside. And then the rest is, things like detail. So let's say I was just quickly painting this. Maybe it's dark in this area, and then it sort of fades as you go down. And then in this case, there's going to be some darker strands. I'm thinking about the places I'm separating the clumps, making those a bit darker, especially near where anything touches. So here near the scalp, I'm letting it get darker. And then in terms of highlights, again, I'm thinking about a band that goes kind of across like this. And then letting these kind of flow. And in this case, it doesn't really need to have much because we're going to use highlights to describe what's going on. So, okay, you have this shape. And then you can just, erase the shapes where you want the highlights. So you could do stuff like this. The light's coming from the top. And depending on where see if I end the highlights here, it says that this part's really, like, this area is very standing up, but if I go down to maybe here, it feels like it's more of a rounded shape. So where you put the highlights is super important because it describes the form. Really, really consider that when you are doing these things. So yeah, in this case, it's something like that. And then this guy has, some highlights here. And that's, that's it. Pretty much this guy's hair's done. Let's just do one more person with let's do another girl, but have like long hair. So again, I often when I do characters, actually, I think of like the big head and hair included. Think of maybe the hairline. Maybe in this case, it's not going in the middle. It's not going exactly in the side. It's kind of going like this. And then I'm going to have an overlap. Like I'm going to have this raised and then fall down. So in this area right here, the hair is sharp. And I know I said you keep the hair soft, and hair is soft. Whenever you think of hair, try and think of it like a soft thing, because it's made of a bunch of different strands. So when you touch them, they're going to be a lot softer. They're not sheet metal. But although the hairline here is soft, this is very important. This is not the hairline. This is the hairline up here, but this is just a strand overlapping. So in that case, you want this to be actually quite hard. You want this edge to be hard, but this edge where the hair connects to the skin is soft. All right, so now I want to do like a floopy thing. So I start here, and I just get my circle going around. So I'm creating these like arcs, and they're kind of describing the form. And I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to complete that. Right, so this is sort of going up and down. And then, I mean, you can add a bunch of strands doing their own thing. Let's say there's like a really high strand. Well, you could do something like this. Start with one, goes down. I meant something I like to do a lot with these types of strands, but yeah, it's kind of nonsense. So I think of them kind of like a triangle coming out, and then so this is like one triangle, and this is two triangles. Anyway, depending on what the hair is doing, it's not going to look like that, but sometimes it does. Anyway, so I actually preferred it before make the hair go too high. So let's not make the hair go too high up. Let's keep it simple. All right, so here's the neck, side of the face, the rest of the body's back here, collarbone. Okay, so this has a nice flow to it. Now I'm going to break down the flow. And then you can add your wispy little ones that are sort of coming off. And see how just adding a few, and it already looks way more complicated than it really is. And maybe there's a strand that comes down here and goes this way. So most of them are going this way, but this one goes this way. Think about the highlight. Where's the highlight? Well, you can make it like a band. And in this case, probably it would be around here. And maybe it actually goes all the way around the head. All right, so this part gets shaded. This part gets shaded. This part. And then this area is going to come down in front. So it's very important to think about what areas of the hair are overlapping other areas. And if this comes in front, then, you know, now it's going to feel like there's more dimension as well, because the hair is, parts of it are coming forward. And there. And then you can sort of split up this highlight by overlapping some extra strands on top, and that just helps to sell things, and you know, I can create more of an interesting shape. Just breaking it up. So basically, you know, you create your strand, have your highlight placement, you can break it up, and you can sort of, you know, intensify the little shapes or describe them better. But yeah, pretty much that's it. As I said, I'm not an expert, so I'm learning as well about hair. But overall, you know, I hope there was information in this that was useful and that it'll aid you in drawing hair. If you do get stuck like me, remember, you can always look up a reference and see, you know, what does that actually look like. And yeah, I hope this helped, and thanks for watching.